Some angels wear scrubs instead of wings. When 41-year-old Maria Santos walked onto the Tonight Show stage with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent 18 years working the night shift, nobody expected her to reveal the most heartbreaking calling in television history. Jimmy Fallon had planned a simple segment about healthcare heroes. Sandra Bullock was there to promote her latest film, but what Maria was about to confess would silence Studio 6B and prove that love truly is the most powerful medicine. The cameras were rolling, the audience was smiling at the dedicated nurse, and then Maria spoke 8 words that shattered every heart in the room. "I sing lullabies to dying patients alone." What came next wasn't just television, it was a glimpse into the sacred moments when strangers become family, when professional duty becomes divine calling, and when one woman's voice becomes the last earthly comfort for those leaving this world. Maria Santos had been working the night shift in the intensive care unit at St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix for exactly 18 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She could tell you the precise count because she had started the job the week after her youngest daughter began kindergarten, when she needed steady income with health benefits, and the night shift paid more than day positions. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement to support her family had become her life's mission, but more than that, it had become her ministry to the dying. St. Mary's ICU was a 40-bed unit that served the most critically ill patients in the greater Phoenix area. The night shift was typically quieter than day shift, fewer procedures, fewer visitors, less medical traffic, but it was also when patients were most vulnerable, most afraid, and most likely to die. During the 13 hours between 7 p.m. and 8 a.m., Maria was often the only consistent presence for patients who were fighting for their lives or losing that fight despite everyone's best efforts. The night shift nursing staff was small, just 4 nurses for 40 critically ill patients, which meant each nurse was responsible for 10 patients at a time. The workload was intense and the responsibility enormous, but Maria had discovered that night shift nursing required skills that went far beyond medical training. It required being a comfort provider, a fear whisperer, a handholder for people who were facing the most terrifying experience of their lives. During her first year on night shift, Maria had been focused primarily on the medical aspects of her job, monitoring vital signs, administering medications, charting patient progress, responding to emergencies. But gradually, she began to notice how different the ICU felt at night. The harsh fluorescent lights were dimmed, the constant bustle of day shift activity gave way to quiet efficiency, and patients who had been surrounded by family and medical teams during the day were often completely alone in the darkness. Night shift is when people get scared, Maria later explained to new nurses she trained. During the day, there are distractions, visitors, constant activity. But at night, when everything gets quiet, that's when patients start thinking about dying. That's when they need more than medical care. They need human comfort. The lullaby singing had begun almost by accident during Maria's second year on night shift. She had been caring for an elderly man named Frank who was dying of pancreatic cancer. Frank's family lived across the country and hadn't been able to travel to Phoenix, so he was spending his final days alone in the ICU. During what would turn out to be his last night, Frank had been restless and afraid, calling out for his late wife and asking repeatedly if anyone was there. Maria had pulled a chair next to Frank's bed and taken his hand, trying to provide the human contact he clearly needed. Without thinking about it, she had begun humming a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child, a gentle Spanish melody that her abuela had used to chase away nighttime fears. The effect on Frank had been immediate and profound. His breathing had become more peaceful, his agitation had decreased, and he had died quietly an hour later, still holding Maria's hand. Something about that night changed me, Maria later remembered. I realized that sometimes the most important thing I could do for a patient wasn't medical at all. Sometimes it was just making sure they didn't die alone and afraid. From that night forward, Maria began incorporating music into her patient care in ways that weren't taught in nursing school. When patients were agitated or afraid, she would hum softly while checking their vital signs. When someone was having trouble sleeping, she would sing gentle lullabies in both English and Spanish. When patients were dying, she would hold their hands and sing them peacefully into whatever came next. The lullabies weren't random selections. Maria had carefully chosen songs that conveyed comfort, peace, and love. She sang traditional lullabies like Brahms' Lullaby and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, religious hymns like Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art, and Spanish songs her grandmother had taught her. She had also learned that different patients responded to different types of music, so she expanded her repertoire to include classic songs like Moon River and The Way You Look Tonight for older patients who might find comfort in familiar melodies from their youth. Over the years, Maria's singing became legendary among her colleagues and the families of her patients. Other nurses would quietly ask Maria to visit their patients who were struggling, knowing that her voice had an almost magical ability to provide comfort. Doctors who worked with Maria learned to listen for her singing as an indicator that a patient needed extra attention or was likely approaching the end of life. Maria has this gift, said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had worked with Maria for over a decade. She seems to know exactly what each patient needs to feel peaceful. Sometimes it's just her presence, sometimes it's holding a hand, but often it's her voice. I've seen her singing calm down patients who were panicking, help insomniacs fall asleep, and provide the most gentle deaths I've ever witnessed. The emotional cost of Maria's approach to nursing was enormous. Every patient she sang to became personal to her in ways that professional boundaries usually prevent. She learned their names, their stories, their fears, and their regrets. When they died, she grieved for them as if they were family members. Over 18 years, Maria had sung to hundreds of dying patients, and she remembered every single one of them. People ask me how I can do this job without getting too attached, Maria said, but I think getting attached is the point. When someone is dying, they need to know that someone cares about them, that their life mattered, that they won't be forgotten. You can't provide that kind of comfort without caring deeply. Maria kept a private journal where she recorded the names of every patient she had sung to sleep, along with details about their lives, their families, and their final moments. The journal wasn't morbid. It was a celebration of lives lived and a record of her privilege to be present during such sacred moments. She wrote about Frank, the pancreatic cancer patient who had started her singing practice. She wrote about Sarah, a young mother who had died from complications after childbirth, and how Maria had sung "You Are My Sunshine" because Sarah had mentioned it was the song she sang to her toddler at bedtime. She wrote about Miguel, an elderly immigrant who had been estranged from his family for decades and died alone, except for Maria's presence. She had sung to him in Spanish, and he had smiled for the first time in weeks when he heard familiar words from his childhood. She wrote about Jennifer, a teenager who had been in a car accident, and how Maria had sung contemporary songs that Jennifer's friends had requested, turning the ICU room into a space of love rather than grief. Each person taught me something about courage, about love, about what matters most when everything else is stripped away, Maria wrote in her journal. They taught me that dying isn't just a medical event, it's a human experience that deserves dignity, comfort, and witnesses who will remember. The physical demands of night shift nursing, combined with the emotional weight of her calling, had taken a toll on Maria over the years. She slept during the day while her children were at school, which meant she rarely saw them during waking hours except on weekends. She had missed school plays, soccer games, and parent-teacher conferences because she was either working or sleeping. Her marriage had ended partly because of the emotional distance that came from spending so much energy caring for dying strangers that she had little left for her own family. But Maria had never considered changing careers or moving to day shift because she knew that her patients needed what she provided during the night hours. Day shift had plenty of nurses, doctors, therapists, and family members to provide comfort and care. Night shift had Maria, and she had come to understand that her presence during those dark, frightening hours was literally the difference between people dying in terror and people dying in peace. I know it sounds dramatic, but I feel like this is what I was put on earth to do, Maria explained to the hospital chaplain during one of their regular conversations. Not everyone gets to know their calling so clearly. I'm lucky that mine happened to coincide with a job that pays the bills. Maria's reputation within the hospital had grown over the years, and she had become the unofficial specialist for end-of-life care. Families would specifically request that Maria be assigned to their loved ones during final days or hours. Other nurses would seek her advice about how to provide comfort to dying patients. Medical students and new nurses shadowed Maria to learn not just technical skills, but how to be present with people during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. But Maria's work remained largely invisible to the outside world. Unlike day shift nurses who interacted with families and received recognition for their care, night shift nurses like Maria did their most important work in the quiet darkness when no one was watching. The families she helped often never knew her name. The patients she comforted were usually unconscious or heavily medicated, and the deaths she made peaceful happened without witnesses who could testify to her compassion. The decision to nominate Maria for The Tonight Show's Healthcare Heroes segment had come from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Moore, the hospital's chief of staff, had been making rounds one night when she witnessed Maria singing to a dying patient whose family hadn't been able to reach the hospital in time. Dr. Moore had watched Maria spend 3 hours sitting with the patient, holding his hand and singing softly, ensuring that he didn't die alone. "I've been in medicine for 30 years, Dr. Moore later said, and I've never seen anything more beautiful or more professional than watching Maria provide comfort to dying patients. She represents everything good about nursing, about healthcare, about human compassion." When Tonight Show producers reached out to Maria about appearing on the show, she was reluctant and confused. She had never sought recognition for her work and was uncomfortable with the idea of discussing death and dying on an entertainment program. But the producers explained that the segment was meant to honor healthcare workers who went beyond their job descriptions to provide extraordinary care, and Maria agreed to participate if it might bring attention to the needs of dying patients and their families. The taping was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November. Maria had never been on an airplane, had never been to New York, and had never taken time off work for anything other than family emergencies. The entire experience was surreal and overwhelming, but she kept reminding herself that she was representing not just herself, but all the night shift nurses who provided comfort in darkness when no one was watching. Sandra Bullock was the evening's main guest, scheduled to promote her latest film. During the pre-show preparation, Sandra had spent time with Maria in the green room, immediately struck by the nurse's calm presence and obvious dedication to her patients. There was something about Maria's gentle strength that reminded Sandra of the nurses who had cared for her own mother during her final illness, and she found herself genuinely moved by Maria's commitment to her calling. The show began with Sandra's interview, which covered the usual promotional topics, but also included discussion of her experiences with healthcare workers during family medical crises. Sandra was known for her appreciation of people who served others, and something about having Maria backstage had made her more reflective about the hidden heroes who provide care during life's most difficult moments. "I think we underestimate how much skill and compassion it takes to care for people who are critically ill," Sandra told Jimmy during the interview. "It's not just medical knowledge, it's emotional intelligence, it's courage, it's the ability to provide comfort when everything feels hopeless." Jimmy nodded, clearly thinking about Maria waiting backstage. Healthcare workers see people at their most vulnerable moments. It takes a special kind of person to handle that responsibility. Exactly. And I think the best healthcare providers understand that healing isn't just about medical intervention. Sometimes it's about human connection, about making people feel less alone when they're scared. This comment would prove to be perfectly prophetic, setting the emotional foundation for what was about to happen when Maria joined them on stage. Speaking of extraordinary healthcare workers, Jimmy announced as Sandra's segment wound down, I want to introduce Maria Santos. Maria has been working the night shift in the ICU for 18 years, and she has found ways to provide comfort that go far beyond traditional nursing care. Sandra, I know you wanted to meet her. Absolutely, Sandra said, her chair being repositioned to make room for Maria. I have tremendous respect for people who dedicate their lives to caring for others. Maria walked onto the stage with the quiet competence of someone who was accustomed to handling life and death situations with calm professionalism. She wore a simple black dress that she had borrowed from her sister, the first formal dress she had worn in years, and her dark hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she wore to work every night. Most notably, she carried herself with a serene confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what her purpose was. Maria, welcome to the show, Jimmy said, helping her get settled in her chair. 18 years of night shift nursing in the ICU. That's incredible dedication. Thank you, Jimmy, Maria replied, her voice carrying the same gentle strength she used to comfort patients. I love my work. It's challenging, but it's also deeply meaningful to be able to care for people during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Sandra leaned forward with genuine interest. Maria, what drew you to ICU nursing, and specifically to night shift work? Maria paused, considering how to explain her calling without sounding overly dramatic. Initially, it was practical. Night shift paid more, and I needed the income to support my family. But I discovered that night shift nursing is different from day shift. The medical needs are the same, but the human needs are more intense. People are more afraid at night, more vulnerable, more in need of comfort. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. What's the most challenging part of your job? The hardest part is watching people suffer, watching families struggle with impossible decisions, and sometimes having to accept that medicine can't fix everything, Maria said honestly, but it's also a privilege to be present during such important moments in people's lives. Sandra's expression grew more serious. Maria, you work with critically ill patients. That must mean you deal with death fairly regularly. This was the territory Maria had both dreaded and prepared to discuss. She took a deep breath and decided to be completely honest about the reality of her work. Yes, Maria said simply, in 18 years of ICU nursing, I've been present for hundreds of deaths, and I've learned that how someone dies is just as important as how they lived. The studio grew quieter as the audience began to understand that this conversation was heading toward profound territory. What do you mean? Jimmy asked gently. Maria looked at the two celebrities who were clearly trying to understand the weight of what she dealt with every night, then at the audience of strangers who were about to learn about the most sacred part of her work. No one should die alone and afraid, Maria said, her voice carrying absolute conviction. When patients are dying, especially at night, when families can't always be present, I try to make sure they feel loved and peaceful in their final moments. Sandra felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand what Maria was describing. How do you do that? I hold their hands, Maria explained. I talk to them even if they seem unconscious because hearing is often the last sense to go. I tell them they're not alone, that they're safe, that it's okay to let go. Jimmy was clearly moved by Maria's description of her work. Maria, that goes far beyond what most people would consider nursing duties. It's all nursing, Maria replied. Caring for people's emotional and spiritual needs is just as important as monitoring their vital signs. Maybe more important in the final moments? Sandra was struggling to maintain her composure. Maria, can you tell us more about how you comfort dying patients? This was the moment Maria had been building toward, the revelation that would expose her most private calling to national scrutiny. I sing to them, Maria said simply. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Jimmy's expression changed from curious to amazed. Sandra's hand flew to her heart as she began to understand the full scope of Maria's compassion. You sing to dying patients? Jimmy asked softly. I sing lullabies, Maria confirmed, gentle songs that help them feel peaceful and loved. Sometimes it's traditional lullabies, sometimes hymns, sometimes songs that were meaningful to them during their lives. The studio was completely silent now, the audience understanding that they were hearing about something sacred and profound. Maria, Sandra said, her voice thick with emotion, how did you start doing this? Maria shared the story of Frank, the elderly cancer patient who had died alone, except for her presence, and how humming a lullaby had brought him peace in his final hour. As she spoke, both Jimmy and Sandra were visibly affected by the image of this nurse singing dying strangers to sleep. After that night, I realized that sometimes the most important medicine I could provide wasn't in a syringe or a pill bottle, Maria continued. Sometimes it was just my voice, letting people know they were loved and not forgotten. Jimmy was openly crying now. Maria, do you understand what you're telling us? You're singing lullabies to dying patients. You're making their last moments on earth peaceful and beautiful. That's the goal, Maria said. I want people to transition from this life to whatever comes next, feeling surrounded by love rather than fear. Sandra stood up and walked over to Maria, clearly overwhelmed by emotion. Maria, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You're literally singing people into heaven. I don't know about heaven, Maria replied with a gentle smile, but I know about peace, and I know that no one should have to face death feeling alone or unloved. Jimmy wiped his eyes and addressed the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, Maria Santos has spent 18 years providing the most compassionate end-of-life care imaginable. She doesn't just treat patients, she loves them through their final moments. The audience responded with sustained, respectful applause, but Maria looked uncomfortable with the attention. I hope people understand that this isn't unusual, Maria said as the applause died down. Nurses everywhere provide this kind of care. We just don't usually talk about it because it feels too personal, too sacred to discuss publicly. Jimmy felt compelled to explore the personal cost of Maria's calling. Maria, emotionally, how do you handle watching so many people die? How do you cope with that kind of loss repeatedly? Maria was quiet for a moment, considering how to articulate something so complex and personal. Every death teaches me something about living, she said finally, about what matters, about how to love more deeply, about how precious every moment is. Yes, it's sad when people die, but it's also an honor to be trusted with someone's final moments. Do you ever think about changing jobs? Sandra asked. Moving to a different department where you wouldn't deal with death so frequently? Never, Maria said without hesitation. This is my calling. These patients need what I provide, and I need to be here for them. It's hard work, but it's the most important work I could imagine doing. Jimmy made a decision that would become one of the most emotional moments in Tonight Show history. Maria, can you sing for us? He asked. One of the lullabies you sing to your patients? Maria looked surprised and slightly uncomfortable. I don't usually perform. The singing is very personal, very private. We understand, Sandra said gently, but maybe sharing one song could help people understand the beauty of what you do. Maria considered the request, then nodded slowly. There's a song my grandmother taught me that I sing when patients seem most afraid. It's in Spanish, but it translates to, "Sleep now, little angel. You are loved, you are safe, you are not alone." Maria closed her eyes and began to sing in a voice that was soft, clear, and filled with more love than most people experience in a lifetime. The melody was simple, but hauntingly beautiful, and even those who didn't understand Spanish could feel the comfort and peace in every note. As Maria sang, something magical happened in the studio. The audience fell completely silent, many people began crying, and even the camera operators found themselves moved by the extraordinary beauty of her voice and the context of when and why she used it. When the song ended, the studio remained silent for nearly a minute. Finally, Sandra spoke through her tears. Maria, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Those patients are so lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, Maria replied. They trust me with their final moments. They let me love them when they're most vulnerable. That's a gift, not a burden. As the segment concluded, something unprecedented happened. The entire studio audience rose not in applause, but in silent reverence, honoring Maria's calling with the respect it deserved. When sound finally returned, it was the sound of people weeping, moved by the recognition that they had witnessed something sacred. Maria's appearance on The Tonight Show became one of the most shared segments in the show's history, but not as entertainment. Families dealing with loss shared it as comfort. Healthcare workers shared it as validation of their calling, and people around the world shared it as proof that angels walk among us in scrubs. The impact extended far beyond television. Hospitals across the country began implementing programs to provide musical therapy for dying patients. Nursing schools began teaching courses on end of life comfort care. Maria received thousands of letters from families thanking her for representing the kind of care their loved ones had received from compassionate nurses. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from her own patients' families, who organized a ceremony to honor Maria's years of service. Over 200 people attended, including children and grandchildren of patients Maria had sung to sleep, thanking her for ensuring their loved ones didn't die alone. Maria gave our father the most peaceful death we could have hoped for, said Robert Chen, whose elderly father had been one of Maria's patients. We couldn't be there because of the pandemic, but knowing Maria was with him, singing to him, holding his hand, that gave us peace too. 6 months later, Maria was invited back to The Tonight Show for a follow-up segment. She brought with her a recording project she had completed, an album of lullabies specifically arranged for use in hospital settings, with proceeds benefiting end-of-life care programs. This is what change looks like, Maria told the audience, holding up the album. When we talk about death with love instead of fear, when we prioritize comfort alongside cure, when we remember that dying people need the same thing living people need, to feel loved and not alone. Maria continues working night shift at St. Mary's ICU, still singing lullabies to patients who need peaceful transitions. Her journal of remembered patients has grown to include over 400 names, each representing a life honored and a death made gentler by her presence. Sometimes the most powerful medicine comes not from pharmaceutical companies or medical technology, but from the human heart expressing love through the simplest of gifts, a gentle voice singing ancient melodies of comfort to those who need to know they matter, they are loved, and they will be remembered. Maria Santos proved that healing isn't always about getting better. Sometimes it's about leaving peacefully, surrounded by love rather than fear, knowing that someone cared enough to sing you safely home.